Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hannah Tyler. In this week's episode, we're back discussing the border, specifically the administration's new Venezuelan parole program, the reasons behind it, and the implications of the program for the future of asylum in the United States with Yael Schacher, the Director for the Americas and Europe at Refugees International, and Matthew LaCourte, Government Affairs Manager for Immigration Policy at the Niskanen Center, and, of course, Theresa Brown, This Week in Immigration regular. Another great episode, so stick around. The Biden administration announced the creation of a new parole program for Venezuelans on October 12th that would admit 24,000 Venezuelans with pre-existing ties to the United States through ports of entry, but would begin to expel other Venezuelans that don't qualify to Mexico under Title 42, in accordance with a new bilateral agreement reached with the Mexican government. The parole program for Venezuelans is modeled after the Uniting for Ukraine program and requires Venezuelans to have a financial sponsor in the United States. This program and the model that the Biden administration has established of using parole programs to admit migrants into the country could have long-lasting implications for the way that the United States addresses asylum seekers in the future. To discuss, we welcome Yael Schacher, Matthew LaCourte, and Theresa Brown. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Glad to be here.
Happy to have you guys. So, Theresa, let's start with you. Can you explain why the Biden administration is implementing this program now and how it relates to the situation at the border?
Sure. So the main reason that they're looking at implementing a program now for Venezuelans in particular is because in the last year, we have seen a significant increase in the number of Venezuelans arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border and entering and asking for asylum. Venezuelans, along with Nicaraguans and Cubans, are the fastest growing percentage of encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border, at times outpacing the encounters for Mexicans and the Northern Triangle of Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And so, unfortunately, or fortunately, so for the administration, managing this new population is a priority. However, the United States does not currently have diplomatic relations with Venezuela. So if we admit people to the United States who ultimately are not granted asylum from Venezuela, we are not in a position to be able to send them back to their country, nor can we send them back to their country under Title 42. So in particular, this population presents a bit of a conundrum for the administration in trying to understand how to manage these arrivals in a way that can ensure that those who need to seek protection can, but is not, in their minds, encouraging additional migration that we can't manage very well. So I think that's the primary focus on why they are announcing this program now. As you mentioned, it's the culmination of a probably months-long set of negotiations with the government of Mexico, allowing Mexico to take back a certain number of Venezuelans under Title 42. However, I would say that given the volume of Venezuelans that we've seen at the border in the last several months, the numbers that the administration is willing to admit under this new program of 24,000 is very small compared to the total. And we understand that Mexico is only willing to take back the same number of Venezuelans under Title 42. So then the question is, what happens to the remainder of the Venezuelans?
Given all that, do you think that this program is going to act as sort of a release valve for the border and the asylum system by decreasing pressure on both these systems and lowering the number of people arriving at the border, or do all these caveats sort of prevent it from acting as that release valve?
I think the caveats matter here. I think right now the small numbers that we're talking about are not going to make a huge difference at the border. I think what the Biden administration is hoping is that the fact that they are willing to return Venezuelans to Mexico, the fact that people who have crossed into Mexico without permission from Mexico are ineligible for this program in the future is going to act as a deterrent for other Venezuelans to make their way to the border. However, there are tens of thousands of Venezuelans already in Mexico or on their way into Mexico through Panama right now, and they're stuck, right? If they can't qualify for this program, if they're not going to be allowed in the United States to ask for asylum, what happens to them? Is Mexico going to start deporting a lot of Venezuelans back to Venezuela? I'm not sure how well that will work either. So I'm not sure how much of an impact it's going to make at the border. My guess is that many Venezuelans will, frankly, be at even more risk of unscrupulous smugglers and people that would prey upon them in Mexico, and would try to come into the country without turning themselves in, which is an even bigger issue for the Border Patrol in the long run to have to deal with. So I think it's temporary. It may or may not have the impact. And again, we're not even talking about some of the other nationalities that we have similar issues in managing, such as the Nicaraguans and the Cubans.
Matthew or Yael, thoughts on this question in particular?
I feel like, Yael, you have a lot to say here, probably.
Well, I mean, I think that, it was already mentioned that, the issue is that there are just a lot more asylum seekers than are being addressed under this program. So it's a little unclear to me. And actually, one of the things that's a little sort of bizarre about the way this has been rolled out is that there's no acknowledgement that these folks are actually asylum seekers or have or should have the ability to seek asylum at the U.S. border. It's not even really mentioned. Like, Title 42 exists. They're referred to as migrants. This is referred to as like a migration control measure. So like the idea of seeking asylum at the border is not mentioned. Under the law, if Title 42 did not exist, actually unauthorized entry is not a bar to asylum. That's one thing. And the other thing is that ports of entry being closed to asylum seekers isn't even mentioned. So like what's a little bizarre to me here is that there are other tools that the administration could also use, and just in terms of migration management tools, like opening the border, figuring out how to process folks at ports of entry. It's unclear to me why, if the ultimate goal of this is to really decrease unauthorized encounters, right? Encounters between ports of entry, why there isn't even any discussion of screening folks in at ports of entry, which would increase the number of Venezuelans who would be eligible. Because I do fear, as Theresa mentioned, that's what's going to end up happening is there's just going to be a lot of Venezuelans sort of stuck in northern Mexico, and we've seen that happen to other populations in the past. So for the folks that have been on the way or are on the way already when the announcement for this was made, that's going to be a case. I agree with Theresa. I think the ultimate goal was actually to deter migration from secondary countries. There's a little lack of clarity as to, who would be beneficiaries of the parole program because of, are they supposed to be folks still in Venezuela? Are they supposed to be folks just like not in Mexico or Panama, but in like other countries in the hemisphere? The numbers are so small that it's hard to know. I mean, if it's either of those populations would not be adequately met by the 24,000, then certainly the populations that are already on the move and in Mexico already. It's such a small program that I can't see it having an effect. And I actually think some of the other migration management tools at the border might have a bigger effect. Like if ports of entry were open, or like if we figured that out, that actually might impact more people given the flows we've been seeing so far.
I would actually like to, Matthew, if you have thoughts, feel free to share them. But I would love to dive into the ports of entry a little bit more and talk about what impact it's had on asylum seekers that ports of entry are still closed, why ports of entry are still closed, and what impact you think it would have on flows at the border if ports of entry were opened again.
Well, I'll leave the port of entry question aside for my colleagues here, but as it relates to the 24,000 figure, which is obviously way too low, and the comparison to Uniting for Ukraine, which is uncapped, in which at this point 65,000 Ukrainians have entered the U.S. in about 6 months since that program was created. The 24,000, there is no justification in the official government documents about the program, but it seems to me that in conversations with folks at DHS and just the realities of how low 24,000 is, that there is an opportunity for that number to go up. And I think that doesn't fix all the problems with what is a imperfect system. But if that number after 24,000 could double once again, and we could start to get that number up to where Uniting for Ukraine is, to me that could change some of the calculus behind the program. And I think how we do that is twofold. First of all, this arrangement between the Mexican government and the U.S. government, I think, needs to work in the sense that the U.S. government wants to see proof of concept about Mexico taking back Venezuelans, and that Mexico is a partner in this regional migration strategy. And the other side, I think DHS wants to see that there is demand from U.S.-based sponsors. Now, mainly that's going to be the Venezuelan American community, but as we saw with the Afghans and then the Ukrainians, those who want to support those populations go beyond just the diaspora communities. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to watch in the coming weeks and months how many sponsor applications are we seeing, how many Venezuelans are being approved, and then how many arrivals are we getting. For Uniting for Ukraine, we got to 24,000 sponsor applications within 2 weeks, which is incredible. And within 5 weeks, we had 24,000 approvals. Within 10 weeks, we had 24,000 arrivals. And so it's going to be interesting to compare the Uniting for Ukraine numbers to the Venezuela parole numbers, and ultimately see where the U.S. government comes down on this question of whether or not Secretary Mayorkas wants to expand this program. Because if they don't, then I think we all realize that these are pretty limited gains in exchange for the Title 42 piece. But if that 24,000 number can be doubled or tripled, I think maybe this conversation could shift.
So I just wanted to say one thing about both the sponsorship and the ports of entries, hopefully get to your question, Hannah, which is, so one of the interesting things, if people have been sort of watching the flows to the border in recent weeks, and I've been, the buses coming to DC where I'm based, of mostly Venezuelans, frankly, coming in Texas on bus here to see. I mean, the issue is, and this is actually kind of gestured at in the Federal Register notice about the program, is that most of the Venezuelans now coming to the border actually do not have sponsors. That's one of the reasons it's been somewhat more challenging to receive them here in the United States, because they don't necessarily have family members to go to. So what this is actually doing is actually shifting the population who is going to be, the Venezuelan population who's going to be able to get refuge, from one which is predominantly people without ties and funds to people who have sponsors here. So it's just it's really a shift. I just wanted to highlight that. Go ahead, Theresa. I see you.
I was just going to add that we've seen, changes in the patterns of Venezuelan migration. Many of the original Venezuelans who were coming in sort of last year and into the beginning part of this year were flying into Mexico because Mexico had visa-free travel for Venezuelans. So people who could afford a plane ticket would fly into Mexico and then make their way to the border. And many of them may or may not have paid a smuggler to get across the border, but they were able to, they had means. And as Yael said, many of them had a place to go, a sponsor, or they knew where they were heading in the U.S. Migrants coming north now are ones that, the United States invade upon Mexico to start requiring visas for Venezuelans. And so that shifted. And so it dropped the numbers of Venezuelans at the border for a while, but then they just started arriving on foot. And now we see them coming up through the Darien, coming up through Panama. So the demand to come to the United States did not go away. Just the means and routes by which people take have changed. And so, to circle back around to your question about ports of entry, it's interesting that the Biden administration touted this program as, well, we'll allow the Venezuelans to fly into the United States. They'll come in through airports. Why is that relevant? Well, as Yael mentioned, our land border ports of entry are still, for the most part, closed to asylum seekers. But also, we have more control over who gets on airplanes. And one of the facets of this program is the ability to screen and vet people before they travel to the United States and be prepared for their arrival. The United States does not have, nor does any country really, have control over who shows up at land borders. They just show up. And that is one of the ongoing problems in managing what's happening at our U.S.-Mexico border right now, is that we can't prepare. We don't know from day to day who's going to show up, what nationalities they are, where they're coming from. There's not a management involved of this migration. It's just happening. And I think it's one of the reasons why successive administrations have been frustrated by this and have worked to try to create policies that would either deter people or prevent them from just showing up at our doorstep. If they come through ports of entry at the land border, we still have that issue of not necessarily knowing who they are. But I would go back again to the comparison to what we did with the Ukrainians. The first thousands of Ukrainians that arrived to the United States actually arrived at the U.S. land border in California. And the U.S. government created a process with an app that they had previously used for readmitting migrant protection protocols people to allow people to kind of self-report to the port of entry before showing up and allow that screening. And we found a way to let them in and parole them in that way. So it is possible, but we're choosing not to do it. And all of the resources that we are putting to, as the administration calls it, decompressing Border Patrol stations for all of these arrivals that they don't have the ability to manage, could be funneled through ports of entry. Now, my caveat to that is our ports of entry are also responsible for millions of dollars in trade, in travel, and people with visas coming through those ports of entry. And the big reason that the government has said through 3 successive administrations now, we don't want all these people coming through our ports of entry is the capacity. If we have to divert a lot of people to processing these asylum seekers at our ports of entry, then we are going to back up the land border ports for trade and travel, and we don't want to do that. But again, this is a resource management issue. This is a logistics issue. It can be done if we are willing to create facilities near ports of entry or transportation networks from a port of entry to another facility where people can be processed there. If we are willing to use some of these technologies that allow people to sort of put in an application before they actually arrive and know who's coming up. There's lots of ways this could be done, but we're not doing it. And I think those are choices that now 3 successive administrations have made.
I agree with that, and I think one of the things that I've thought the whole time, I'm not opposed to the idea of parole. I think it's a tool in like a toolbox, right, of different strategies that you can take to admit people, different pathways. And I think what I find frustrating as sort of coming out is that this is sort of being used and other tools, and it's in the notice of the Venezuela program today that was put out in the Federal Register. You know, it was this parole program, this small parole program is, you know, the U.S. leading by example. It's literally the term used in the register about how the U.S., you know, is leading the hemisphere and showing the way forward. And my response to that is, well, we've got to do a little bit more than just this small program. There are a lot of other tools we could use. One of them, Theresa just mentioned, we could figure out a system at our ports of entry. We could use our refugee resettlement system. And, you know, the idea that us, you know, sort of paying some money to Colombia, which is hosting, you know, 2.5 million Venezuelans, plus a 24K parole program is enough and leading by example. I will not accept that. I think we can, there's a lot more, and, you know, Theresa just talked about it, there's a lot more we could do. And I would see, you know, if this parole program were paired with a lot more other pathways to protection for people, it would put me, you know, it would bring truer to me that this was something more than just really a deterrent policy that's being put in place with a little bit of, you know, parole on top, but not much at all. So I think for me, that's the key thing. What else is going to be done to provide for so many Venezuelans who are the Ukrainian parole program is bigger. We're also using refugee resettlement for Ukrainians who are eligible for it. And Ukrainians have protections all over Europe in bigger ways. And there's actually an argument that Ukrainians, there's an argument for using parole for Ukrainians, maybe that's different. If this is in fact temporary and many Ukrainians actually will go back, that is an open question, right, about whether or not that's actually true. And anyway, refugees can come as refugees and then go back. I mean, this is not like, there's not one size fits all here, but I do think that why we would use parole for Venezuelans is a question to me as the primary pathway toolbox. Do we not think these folks are refugees? Do we not think that they're going to stay permanently? Do we expect Congress to figure out how they're going to stay permanently? All those questions sort of seem to kick things down the road a little bit and leave a lot of other tools unused and questions unanswered.
Yeah, I mean, the huge piece here is that the state of the U.S. resettlement program is so shoddy that it resettled something like 175 Venezuelans last year out of literally millions that have left. And at the same time, 70% of FY21 asylum decisions for Venezuelans were decided and the Venezuelan was given asylum. So clearly we are recognizing, both UNHCR and through the asylum system, that Venezuelans are being persecuted and we're resettling 175 in an entire fiscal year without a functioning resettlement system. And this has impacts for populations way beyond Venezuela. Without a functioning resettlement system, we've essentially gotten rid of one of those tools in the toolkit. And not that a functioning resettlement system was going to manage Venezuelan immigration at the U.S.-Mexico border, but it was another piece of that puzzle, and that doesn't exist anymore. And so I think we all, in the wider immigration advocacy community, want this administration to do more when it comes to resettlement, whether that is improving the processing time, whether it's expanding the overall numbers. I think that the administration has been very underwhelming in its rebuild of the resettlement program that was essentially sabotaged in the last administration. And we're seeing some of that with this parole question. I think the other piece, and this was covered in some of the initial reporting about the Venezuela parole program, was initially last week, the discussion was internally at DHS about Nicaragua, Cuba, Haiti, and Venezuela as part of this, what would have been a 4-pronged parole program. And to me, that suggests that there is a conversation happening within the administration about what we can call the Uniting for Ukraine model, and how we can apply that in a much broader context. So ultimately, obviously, Venezuela was the only one that was included, and there are refugee crises, and Theresa was getting at this earlier. There is, large flows from those 3 other countries as well. Whether there is an opportunity to take this model and roll it out in a way that prevents the chaos we've seen in just the last week throughout the journey from Venezuela to the U.S., but also specifically in northern Mexico, where all of a sudden on a Wednesday afternoon, the border is totally shut down and everyone's being Title 42. If we can find a way to manage regional migration with expanded parole, in addition to other legal channels, whether that is refugee resettlement, whether that's included in the H-2B announcement that we saw last week, whether that also includes some of these provisions, Theresa, you were getting at about how Ukrainians came to the U.S.-Mexico border in March and April and how they were admitted. And so obviously we're talking about a lot of ways to address a really complicated situation, but it does seem to me that clearly this administration is very interested in this model of sponsorship through humanitarian parole and pairing that with Title 42. I think that we can all imagine a world in which the Title 42 piece looks different than it does in this context, but a new kind of border management apparatus is coming into view, I think, if this administration is serious about expanding this to multiple countries in this hemisphere and ultimately taking those numbers from 24,000 to a lot higher.
I was just going to step in here because I think there's a few things that it's worth saying. One is this, and I think Yael has mentioned this, is parole by definition is a temporary status. Now, the advantage of parole over letting somebody in to eventually apply for asylum is that you can apply for work authorization with parole much earlier. We know that USCIS, which processes asylum applications and parole applications and EADs for everybody, is hugely backlogged and delayed. And so one issue I have with this expansive use of parole is that it is, as Yael said, sort of kicking the can down the road. We are going to have a huge bubble of asylum applications show up at USCIS sometime in the future that will have to be adjudicated. And so maybe instead of just adding people to an ever-growing backlog in immigration court, you're adding them to an ever-growing backlog at USCIS, but it's still an ever-growing backlog. The advantage, I think, of having somebody in immigration court, if it can be said to be an advantage, is that somebody whose parole expires, who has a pending asylum application, doesn't technically have a status in the U.S., right? And so, coordination with ICE, are they going to be subject to deportation in the meantime? All of those kinds of things. If you have a case pending in immigration court, it's not a protection, but you at least have a standing. You are in process in a way that you're not with just a pending asylum application. And so that limbo status that it puts people in is weird. Like, look, we have backlogs across our entire immigration system. We are, frankly, in my mind, our immigration system is on the verge of collapse. There are more people coming into the system that can be processed in any reasonable amount of time, whether we're talking immigration courts or asylum applications or legal immigration visas or EADs or, frankly, green card holders trying to just get a new green card, renew their green card every 10 years. The system's not working. And so this has some advantages. It is quicker for the administration to implement than some of these other longer term solutions. But we do have to understand the back end of this, which is an ever-growing list of people in the United States with quasi-status, with no decision on whether or not they can stay, and in a system that's incapable of adjudicating it. We can't separate those things out, and I think that we have to start recognizing that our border problem isn't just a border problem. It's an immigration system problem.
Yeah, and if I could just add, the history of parole is such that it used to be the tool we use for refugees, right? For refugee populations, right? Before we actually had refugee law essentially functioning in this country, when we had a standard that was supposed to be not nationality based, so these parole programs are like we sort of give them for a country, a nationality. It's abstracted from an assessment, an individualized assessment of need, of vulnerability. Because it's a national, it's quicker because it's like a blanket nationality assessment, but what it leads to is sort of like inequities in how they're done, right? So the Ukrainian program is bigger than the Venezuelan program. There is no Afghan parole program, group program for Afghans, which means that they're not out. And then we have other types of parole programs. We have a program that helps Cuban families unite in this country, and we have a similar one for Haitians, but it's much less capacious, right? Has much more eligibility restrictions for Haitians. So what you end up getting is the sort of like patchwork for sort of vulnerable refugee-like populations, and that's all because Congress didn't want parole to be used for refugees anymore, right? So it's like this weird discretionary standard. And the other thing about the way these new parole programs are being... So I'm actually worried a little bit about congressional backlash, Theresa. Like, Congress has been steadily, historically reining in parole and the use of it. And for people who are on the other side of this and think that, less Venezuelans should be coming in and that may see this as an abuse of executive power to use these kinds of programs. So I'm worried a little bit about, it's swinging the other direction. And that's happened with suits over the CAM program and other uses of parole. So we have to sort of be wary of that on the other side. And then the other thing is that, as you said, there's this limbo status, and I think, I'm just not sure, what ultimately can happen to the people who are paroled in. It's a discretionary power that can be taken away as sort of easily as it can be given. And I think that to me it's insecure. It's fundamentally an insecure status. So, and I agree about it being, if this is the tool that's going to be used, it feels like it's less, there's even less standards for how it's used. Because it's discretionary and because there's sort of, it can be done and it can be used for so many different purposes. So I worry about inequities that are untethered from the needs of vulnerable populations. And again, the way it's being set up with this private sponsorship model, it makes it look similar to our family-based immigration system. Because basically what you're doing is, you're basically saying this is sort of like having a financial sponsor, like you would for a family visa or an employment visa or something like that, or I guess mostly family visa in this case. And the thing about that is, having a system that's more like our family-based immigration system is not actually the same thing as a humanitarian program that helps the most vulnerable, right? Anybody who doesn't necessarily have a family tie. So I think we also have to think through this idea of creating a system that, and I understand the desire to have private sponsorship because it gets around the problem of the public not needing to provide as many services, the expense of providing for so many newcomers, right? I understand that, but it does mean that it looks more like our family immigration system and less like a humanitarian parole program, that would help the most vulnerable based on a vulnerability standard, for example.
So I agree with everything that's been said, but this is how I think about it. This Congress, with unified Democratic control, has utterly no ability to do any of the things that any of us on this call want them to do on immigration. The next Congress, likely, within the first 6 months, is going to try to shut the government down unless the Biden administration essentially Title 42s every single person. And they are, in reporting today, the next likely Speaker of the House is ready to say they would not support DACA and border security together, that border security has to come before doing anything else, border security as a single entity. And when we say border security, we're not talking about the things that we have laid out on this call. So the political reality, given a Congress that has been broken and unable to do immigration reform in whatever the number is now, 30 plus years, plus the election reality that we're about to get a Congress, probably the most antagonistic house towards immigrants in, I don't know, Yael, you're a historian, you can tell us what the last Congress that was more hostile to immigrants. And this administration is stuck in a place where the courts are shooting down almost everything that they try to do when it comes to their administrative actions. And when you take that backdrop of horrendousness when it comes to enacting a border migration strategy, I think the idea that we can expand parole and provide a legal and safe pathway for some folks to come here, whether that's 24,000 or more, is an opportunity worth pursuing. I think that an administration that has expressed a desire to expand these legal pathways through parole is something, that door is open and we should be pressing on that door. And what they've done with Uniting for Ukraine is a massive accomplishment that I think we should be lifting up. I mean, we're going to have more than 150,000 Ukrainians enter the U.S. through Uniting for Ukraine this year, a program that a lot of people thought would take 6 months or a year and a half, and people can come here in a month. if they get their application approved. And so I think that there are lots of great ideas and ways that we can better manage migration, expand legal pathways, and ultimately provide opportunities for people in what would be the way that we conceive of the American immigration system, which is one that expands justice and opportunity and not limits it. But I just don't think that that's the political and policy and legal reality that we live in October 2022. And given that backdrop, to me, this program on the parole side provides a real opportunity, but pairing it with the immediate expulsions was obviously horrendous, caused chaos and continues to cause chaos, and is something that the administration shouldn't have moved forward with. But the door being open on expanding that number from 24,000 to a higher number and having more populations added to potential parole pathways is something that I find compelling.
So I would like to ask, what would those expanded pathways look like, this like 4-pronged strategy that you mentioned earlier that the government was discussing, and what would need to happen for the administration to start moving forward with that strategy?
Well, the original reporting was the 4 countries were Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and the administration could do that tomorrow if they wanted. What I would suggest is they have a more organized and coordinated rollout of that announcement, potentially include more stakeholders in thinking through what that looks like, and then ultimately providing a little bit more clarity to folks on the ground about how that program is ultimately going to be rolled out. And I think if, they announced that last Wednesday, we're taping this on Tuesday, today they announced the program, there are days there in which people thought that they could come to the U.S.-Mexico border and expect something, and that policy was changed overnight. And that seems like if they're ever going to expand it, the chaotic rollout is completely unnecessary and something that they should find ways to change.
I would be willing to bet $100 or more that the reason that it was not announced ahead of time is what always gets thought of when these programs are coming out, which is we don't want to cause a rush to the border, right? If this program is limited to people who meet certain qualifications, the administration, particularly DHS, particularly CBP, was concerned that it would create a lot of people rushing to get to the border and get in under the current rules before this exclusionary or more restrictive policy is put in place. And I think, Yael, as you said in the Federal Register notice, that's why it's an interim final rule, or temporary rule as it is. That is always the mantra. And that is the challenge with all border policies, right? There's this balance. I tend to think that the U.S. government tends to overestimate the impacts of our policy on the overall migration phenomenon. People don't decide to come to the United States based on what they understand our U.S. immigration policy is. They decide to leave their countries and come to the United States because of their own reasons, usually what's happening in their own lives in their own countries. That having been said, there is at least a temporary effect of our border policies. We've seen it. We've seen it over and over. We've seen it under the Obama administration, the Trump administration, whether it's restrictive or open, if it's perceived versus real, right? We know that migrants will respond to what they believe the policy to be, even if the policy is not that. But those are usually temporary reactions, especially if the move or the motive for migration is so strong. And I think over the last, frankly, 8 years, we in the United States, the governments have consistently underestimated the desperation that drives this group of migrants compared to, I think, some migrants that we have seen in the past. These are not people who think I can come to the United States and make some money temporarily and help my family back home and then go back. These are people who say, I have nothing back home, or if I stay at home, I will die, or my wife will die, or my child will die, or my child will be raped. Like this is existential for them in a way that I don't think we have seen with the majority of U.S.-Mexico migration for the last century. And so, again, our ability to influence that through our policies is not going to be as strong. And we just need to recognize that. And that's why we need to think a little more holistically. I agree with Matt. The politics of this are not great. And so if this is the pragmatic of what can be done now that's slightly better than what we had before, great, we'll take it. But I think we'd be remiss if we don't keep making the case that we need to think bigger. We need to think holistically. We need to stop playing whack-a-mole with whatever the latest crisis at the border is and think more long-term. Because this is a phenomenon that's now 8 years. It's not a temporary thing. It's not a blip. This is the new migration reality, and let's deal with that as it is. And yes, I will keep harping on Congress to get its together and legislate. And that means Republicans and Democrats coming together to actually legislate together, because otherwise we're just going to have more and more sort of temporary fixes that result in bigger problems down the road, to my mind.
Just two follow-up points to what's been said, which I agree with, really, is that the existential issue that Theresa was mentioning. I mean, I was just in Guatemala last week, and I met Venezuelans who are coming through. And the issue is that a lot of the movement is actually not directly from Venezuela at this point. First of all, that's another thing. I mean, the Federal Register notice makes it seem like this parole program is just for people, because they're leaving Venezuela right now. But the vast majority of people are leaving second countries at this point, Colombia, Ecuador, where they still can't make a life for themselves. The UN had a report out this week that 75% of people in those countries still don't have enough to feed themselves, 3 square meals. They don't have education for their kids. This is existential, right? This is can I find a place where that life is possible for me? And I think it's going to be hard. And I know that the administration wants to work with other countries in the hemisphere. And I think that is the right move. The issue, though, is that the United States still is the biggest, richest country in the hemisphere, and it has a tradition of immigration, and to just pretend that we don't anymore and that it's everybody else's responsibility, it just doesn't make sense in terms of what people are thinking about, what people think about for the United States. And I don't know if this is too cynical, and I'd love the thoughts of the others on this who know so much and are so attuned to sort of the politics and the policies of the past, but do you guys think maybe I'm too cynical, and I think maybe the chaos is deliberate, because it's almost like we do a lot of expulsions at the top, right, early, right when we roll this out, hoping that it will have a deterrent effect, right? Look, if the U.S. can only send 24,000 people back to Mexico, that's not a lot, as we've been talking about, given the migration stream. So let's make a big show of expelling a couple thousand people the first week and hope that it has that dramatic effect. And frankly, I mean, I find that sort of despicable as a strategy, but I think there must be some in the administration who know what Theresa and Matt have said, that this is a bigger problem, this is a bigger issue. We're not going to stop. Not everybody is super attuned to U.S. policies. That's not how they make migration decisions. I mean, so from a sort of rolling out policy point of view, is this a sort of dramatic, sudden kind of policy change in order to have a deterrent effect? To try to say, okay, let's make it seem like even if we actually don't have the power to continue this, given the way it's, let's try to make it seem like it. So maybe we shift the calculus. Maybe we mess up the smugglers a little bit. Maybe we try to figure out a way to shift migration patterns, which frankly are not really in their control. right? As Theresa said.
I did have a little flashback to 2012 and DACA being announced right before the 2012 election, in a hope to boost some voter turnout. They thought, well, we'll see what this does.
I think the fact that we're 3 weeks before an election is interesting timing. And I don't know. I think like an assessment of major administration policies that come out from the election, like the 6 weeks prior, like looking at that list is going to be interesting, and where this falls in that list will be interesting. So I think that the politics and potentially the chaos as a strategy is definitely possible.
Okay, so I have a closing question for everyone since we're nearing end of our time. Theresa sort of addressed this earlier, but what do you think it says about the immigration system as a whole that administrations continue to come up with these temporary programs to manage the border and manage immigration and admit people through new pathways, and what realistically can be done to stop relying on these temporary programs? Or is it, like Matthew said, kind of like the option that we're left with now?
I think if Congress is incapable of modernizing immigration law and policy, we are left with an administration, whether that is President Obama or Trump or Biden or the next president, that is left with trying to do things administratively. And there's only so much you can do administratively. And it kind of just becomes a question of like all of U.S. immigration policy is what can be accepted by courts, and we're just fighting everything out in the courts. And like Congress's role in immigration at this point is minor compared to the role of the courts. And so I think without Congress, we're just left with administrative attempts, and which ultimately are always kind of half-baked and temporary and not as holistic. And I think that until Congress does something, we're left with that as all we can get.
I agree with that. Generally, I think since the 1990s, we've been in sort of like a restrictionist framework, right, towards immigration. And until we kind of change the law fundamentally to sort of make it less restrictive legally by Congress, we're going to be dealing with these administrative measures and, as Matthew said, fighting out the meaning of them in the courts, whether or not they abide by the restrictionist framework we currently have, right? So that's, and then the thing I'll say about refugees and asylum, just because that's really where my attention really lies, is that I think one of the kind of bizarre things is that, you know, part of the reason we might turn to parole is because actually the refugee standard is not so much that, I mean, we definitely should have it, but it doesn't actually meet the need anymore. Like, we have people displaced by climate, we've got people displaced by like a million things that actually are very hard to fit. Advocates do a good job trying to figure out how people who really, really need protection can fit under that standard, but we really need Congress to actually think about, okay, and now, today, in 2025, or whatever they get around to it, 2020, 2023, you know, what should be who's worthy of protection? Like, who is worthy of that humanitarian protection now? And until we do that, too, we're going to try to be fitting people who need protection under a standard that doesn't really fit, and then we're going to use administrative parole-like things to help other vulnerable people who actually might not necessarily win asylum anyway, right? Like, given after the end of the long, drawn-out process. And the last thing is, like, what all that Congress, so much of what we've been trying to do because of the impasse that Matthew described is we do it with appropriations, right? Like, anything that gets done is at best going to get done like in an omnibus or in an appropriations act, which it has to pass or else everything shuts down. And that just confines the debate so much and limits the actual like robust conversation in Congress, because you're trying to like sneak something in essentially, right, into where it doesn't belong, and do a lot where there's really not that much room to do anything. So that's sort of the impasse we're in. So I kind of agree with what Matthew said.
And I'll just say that, I mean, one of the outcomes, as Matt said, of the courts basically dictating our immigration policy right now might be, perversely, that Congress will take it back up. Congress is happy to let the courts like take difficult problems off their plate, like witness the fact that they have not tried to really address DACA, even though they know that courts will kill it sooner rather than later. And it just is an excuse not to have to vote on it. But at the same time, they're letting the executive branch take their prerogatives from them. They're letting the courts decide what should be their job to decide. And, historically, Congress has tried very hard, I think, to stand up for those prerogatives in ways that, presidents of various parties have not really appreciated. But to completely abdicate a policy field like this and say, you know what, we're just as happy not dealing with it and letting these other branches of government, like, where's Congress's sort of institutional responsibility and sense of its own power? It's a co-equal branch of government. It is not subsidiary to a president, even a president of their same party. And Matt said, we have had one-party control of the House, Senate, and White House, of both Republican and Democratic Party control. And neither party has on their own been able to get their preferred immigration stuff passed. So if they can't do it within their own party, why are they not trying to work with the other guys and get something? I think if the system continues to break down further, maybe they'll finally come back around and say it's our job and we'll get it done. That's my hope.
Well, I have greatly enjoyed listening to this fascinating conversation. So thank you all so much for your time and your insights, and signing off. And that's our show for today. Thanks to our guests, Yael Schacher and Matthew LaCourte, and of course BPC's Theresa Brown. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Brown at BPC_T Brown, and I'm on Twitter at HannahETY. I'm Hannah Tyler. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Brown. This week's episode was written by Hannah Tyler and Theresa Brown. Alex Verisco is our audio producer and editor. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.